Harold Johnson rose early that Tuesday morning, just as he did every day. At 72, his body wasn't as fast as it once was, but he still had the discipline of a soldier. A retired U.S. Army Master Sergeant, Harold had served 3 tours, earned a Bronze Star, and raised a daughter who now served the city in a very different way, as mayor. Wearing his usual windbreaker and his faded Army veteran cap, Harold grabbed his cane and left his modest home in the heart of the city for his morning walk through Fairview Park. It was a ritual, a quiet, grounding routine that gave him time to reflect and greet neighbors. Birds chirped overhead. Joggers nodded politely. Children waited at the bus stop near the playground. Harold offered them a warm smile. He was well known here. Respected. Even loved. But that morning, something was different. A white police cruiser rolled slowly down the path, windows tinted, tires crunching on the gravel. It came to a stop right by the bench where Harold had paused to catch his breath. The door opened. A young white officer stepped out, tall, buzz-cut, new to the force. Harold turned to greet him with a courteous nod. But the officer didn't return it. He frowned. And what he said next would shift the tone of the day, and become the spark for a story the entire city would soon be talking about. Officer Kyle Granger adjusted his belt and walked slowly toward Harold Johnson, one hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm. His gaze swept over Harold's worn cap, the military insignia stitched at the front, the neatly pressed windbreaker, and the old man's cane. "You live around here?" the officer asked, flatly. Harold nodded. "I've lived in this neighborhood since 1981. Granger's tone was immediately dismissive. "Gonna need to see some ID." Harold furrowed his brow. "Is there a problem, officer? You were sitting here watching kids, loitering in the park. Some people might find that suspicious." Granger's eyes narrowed as if daring Harold to argue. Harold stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "Son, I served this country before you were born. I've walked this park longer than you've worn that badge." Granger snorted. "Yeah? That a threat?" Several bystanders began to take notice. A woman on a bench nearby began quietly recording with her phone. Another jogger slowed down, her expression concerned. "I didn't threaten you," Harold said calmly. "But I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal for sitting in my neighborhood park." Granger stepped closer. "Look, just give me your ID and stop talking back, all right? You people always want to make it difficult." The phrase, "you people," dropped like a stone. Harold's jaw tightened. He slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and clear. "You're crossing a line, officer." "Yeah?" Granger said, scoffing. "Maybe I'll take you downtown for obstruction." More people were watching now. One man called out, "That's Harold Johnson. He's a vet. Leave him alone." But Granger didn't listen. He was too deep in his power trip to notice the shifting mood, or the incoming black SUV slowly pulling up to the curb. The back door opened. Mayor Danielle Johnson stepped out. The moment Danielle Johnson stepped out of her SUV, silence swept across the park like a passing storm cloud. She was dressed for city business, blazer sharp, heels clicking with every step, her staffer following a few paces behind with a tablet in hand. Her eyes scanned the scene. She saw her father standing upright but visibly tense. The officer, a stranger to her, had his hand near his holster. The small crowd, murmuring, their phones out. She understood everything in seconds. "Dad?" she called firmly, but with concern. Harold's posture relaxed slightly. "Over here, baby." Granger turned, startled, and immediately straightened when he recognized who had spoken. His face went pale. The blood drained from it as quickly as authority had drained from his stance. "Madam Mayor," he stammered. I didn't realize." Danielle's heels stopped just feet from him. "No, Officer Granger, you didn't. But let's be very clear, you didn't need to know who he is. You only needed to know who you are." Granger looked like he wanted to sink into the pavement. "I didn't mean anything by it. He didn't comply. I asked for ID dash. He's a 72-year-old veteran. Sitting in a park. In his neighborhood," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "And you humiliated him." The crowd was still watching. Cameras still rolling. Harold didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His daughter was doing what he taught her whole life, speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. You insulted a man who served this country, raised a family here, and has done more for this city than you likely ever will," Danielle continued. Granger opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. "Save it." Then she turned to the crowd. "This isn't about him being my father," she said. "This is about what so many men like him go through every day. It's about all the elders, veterans, and citizens who are treated like suspects because of their skin, not their actions." She reached for Harold's hand. "And it stops now." By the time Mayor Danielle Johnson and her father left the park that morning, the video had already hit social media. Within hours, it had been shared by community leaders, veterans groups, and civil rights advocates across the country. The footage was unmistakable: a decorated black veteran disrespected and harassed by a white officer, and only treated with dignity after the mayor intervened. The city's police department was flooded with calls. Local news aired the confrontation on the evening broadcast, and national outlets picked it up by morning. Comment sections filled with outrage, not just because of who Harold was, but because of how easily it could have been anyone. The mayor's office released a statement. "We will not tolerate racial profiling, abuse of power, or the disrespect of our elders, especially those who have served this country with honor. Every citizen deserves dignity. No exceptions." Behind closed doors, things moved quickly. Officer Granger was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. His supervisor, embarrassed by the optics and community backlash, issued a public apology, though many viewed it as too little, too late. But for Danielle, this wasn't about headlines. She spent the next days meeting with her chief of police and civil rights liaisons, drafting immediate reforms. Among them, mandatory racial bias training, community walk-alongs for new recruits, and a new directive prioritizing veteran identification in all field interactions. She also made one phone call that meant more to her than any press release. To her father. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I've been through worse," Harold said, his voice steady. "But I'm proud of how you handled it." "You shouldn't have had to go through that in the first place," she replied. "I know," he said. "But maybe now, fewer people will." Danielle leaned back in her chair, the city skyline beyond her office window glowing in the sunset. Change was always slow. But this was a start. The days following the incident at Fairview Park revealed something powerful. The city wasn't just watching, it was waking up. On Saturday morning, over 300 residents gathered in front of City Hall for a peaceful unity walk. Veterans in uniform stood alongside teenagers with handmade signs that read "Respect our elders" and "Justice means dignity." Police officers were invited, not to patrol, but to listen. Harold didn't plan to speak. But when the crowd spotted him in the front row, they began to chant his name. "Harold! Harold!" He stepped up to the microphone, weathered hands gripping the podium, his army cap slightly tilted from the breeze. "I didn't want all this," he said. "I just wanted a walk in the park." The crowd chuckled gently, respectfully. But maybe that moment wasn't just mine. Maybe it was for every person who's ever been judged before being understood. For every vet, for every elder, for every black man or woman who's had to prove their worth over and over again, just to be seen. People stood silent, moved. "I'm not angry. I'm tired," he added. But tired doesn't mean finished. Applause broke out, not wild, but warm, deep, knowing. The mayor took the stage after her father and announced the city's new Respect and Recognition Task Force, aimed at improving the relationship between law enforcement and community members, especially veterans and seniors of color. Volunteers signed up on the spot. Donations flowed in. Local schools added Harold's story to upcoming civics lessons. And perhaps most importantly, the police chief publicly endorsed the changes. "This isn't about damage control," he said at a press conference. "This is about accountability. And we have work to do." Even Officer Granger, still suspended, reportedly asked to attend community listening sessions. The mayor had made it clear, reform was not optional, it was overdue. Harold didn't ask for the spotlight. But somehow, by standing with quiet dignity, he'd become the city's most powerful symbol of change. The small community room inside the police precinct was filled with quiet tension. Folding chairs lined the space, a coffee pot bubbled in the back, and a printed sign near the door read, "Community Reflection Session, Listening, Learning, Reform." Harold Johnson walked in with the steady grace of a man who had nothing left to prove. The room hushed as he took a seat at the front, not to speak yet, just to be present. Across from him, wearing civilian clothes and a stiff expression, sat Officer Kyle Granger. Granger looked younger than he had in the videos. Stripped of his uniform, he seemed less imposing, more uncertain. His leg bounced nervously as he waited for the session to begin. After a few community members spoke, veterans, elders, teenagers who had watched the video and felt seen, it was Harold's turn. He rose slowly, cane in hand, and looked directly at the man who had once spoken to him like a criminal. "You remember me now, Officer Granger?" Harold asked gently. Granger nodded. "Yes, sir." Harold tilted his head. "Funny. Didn't sound like sir that day." There was a nervous chuckle from the audience, but Harold didn't smile. "I'm not here to humiliate you," he continued. "I'm here because someone like me will cross your path again. And the next time, it better go differently." Granger swallowed hard, then stood. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low. "I didn't see you. I saw what I thought you were. And I'm ashamed of that." He looked around the room. "I've spent the last few weeks realizing how much I didn't know, about the people I serve, about myself. And I can't undo what I did. But I can change what I do next." The room was silent for a beat. Then Harold extended his hand. "Then do better." Granger took it. Not everyone clapped. Some still didn't trust the gesture. But it was real, and it was a start. That evening, the precinct announced that Granger would not return to patrol until he completed the full 6-month community service and training program now mandatory for all officers flagged for bias complaints. The old Harold might have stayed angry. But the man who stood there now, hand extended, knew that change never came from rage alone. Sometimes, it started with a quiet reckoning, and a handshake. 1 month later, Fairview Park looked different. It wasn't the trees or the benches, it was the people. Families of every background gathered for the city's annual Unity Celebration, a tradition meant to honor veterans and community leaders. But this year, something special was planned. At the center of the park stood a newly unveiled bronze plaque mounted on a polished stone pedestal. A small crowd surrounded it, cameras flashing, kids on their parents' shoulders. Mayor Danielle Johnson stepped onto the small stage. She didn't need a microphone, the city was already listening. "We gather today," she began, "not just to recognize service in uniform, but service in spirit, the kind that teaches dignity through action, and leadership through humility." She paused, then turned to her father. "My father, Harold Johnson, taught me what strength looks like when it's quiet. What honor looks like when it's challenged. And what justice feels like when it's earned, not demanded." The crowd erupted in applause. Harold, sitting near the front, shook his head with a modest smile. "I told her not to make a fuss," he whispered to the veteran beside him. Danielle stepped down and led her father to the plaque. Together, they pulled back the cloth. It read, "Harold Johnson Memorial Bench, in honor of those who serve their country and their community with quiet courage. May every person who sits here be seen, heard, and respected." The crowd stood in a long ovation. People approached Harold one by one, parents, teachers, even off-duty officers, to shake his hand and thank him. Not for being the mayor's father, but for being their example. In the distance, Officer Granger stood quietly, not in uniform. He didn't approach, didn't make a scene. Just watched, and nodded. As the sun dipped low over the park, Harold took a seat on the bench that now bore his name. Children played nearby. Neighbors chatted. The city pulsed gently around him. And for the first time in a long time, Harold didn't feel like a man who had to be strong. He just felt at peace.